She shielded a stranger from gunfire the next day. The Mafia boss claimed her as his wife. The coffee cup shattered against the wall behind Alara's head. Hot liquid and ceramic shards exploded outwards, a spray of bitter rain that missed her by a whisper. She didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She simply closed her eyes for a single, measured second, a silent prayer for a strength she had to borrow from a future self, who was no longer here, no longer trapped. When she opened them, her expression was one of serene, heartbreaking calm. "I'll get a dustpan for that, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice a soft melody in the suddenly silent diner. Frank Henderson, a man whose body was a testament to cheap beer and cheaper rage, sneered. His face was a blotchy map of indignation. He was a former cop who'd been dismissed for reasons no one ever spoke aloud, but everyone understood, and he carried that chip on his shoulder like a second phantom badge. "You think a dustpan fixes this?" he bellowed, jabbing a thick finger at her. "You call this service? I asked for a warm-up, not a cup of mud you left on the burner since dawn." He was lying. The coffee was fresh. It was always fresh. Alara made sure of it. The diner, a small pocket of warmth and worn vinyl called the Starlight, was frozen. The morning regulars, the old men reading their papers, the young couple in the corner booth, all of them stared, forks hovering over plates. They were the chorus, a silent audience to Frank's daily performance of petty tyranny, and Alara was always his unwilling co-star. This was the crescendo. He had been escalating for weeks, his complaints growing louder, his insults sharper. Today, he had finally crossed the line from verbal cruelty to a physical act of aggression. Alara stood her ground, a small, slender island in his storm. Her uniform was immaculate, her apron tied just so. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll, but her spine was forged from something far stronger. It was forged from necessity. Frank took a step closer, invading her space, his stale breath washing over her. He loved this moment, the fear in people's eyes, the way the world shrank to accommodate his anger. This was power. This was control. "What's the matter, sweetheart?" he taunted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, greasy whisper. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you finally realizing your place?" He reached out, his hand moving to grab her arm, to punctuate his victory with a final act of ownership. The bell above the diner door chimed. It was a gentle sound, a delicate ting that was usually lost in the clatter of cutlery and conversation. But in the thick, suffocating silence, it cut through the air like a church bell on a still morning. No one turned to look at first. Their attention was riveted on the drama at the counter, but then a presence moved through the room. It wasn't a sound. It was a change in pressure, a shift in the very quality of the air. It was the feeling of a shadow falling over everything, a cold, quiet weight that settled on the shoulders of every person in the room. A man now stood beside Frank Henderson. He hadn't been there a moment ago. He seemed to have materialized from the silence itself. He was tall, dressed in a simple, dark suit that fit his broad shoulders so perfectly it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. His hair was dark, his face was a mask of stoic calm, but his eyes were ancient. They were chips of obsidian that saw everything and revealed nothing. He placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. It was not a violent gesture. It was gentle, almost casual, but the effect was immediate and profound. Frank Henderson froze, his own hand still inches from Alara's arm. The sneer on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Frank turned, ready to snarl at this stranger, to tell him to get lost. He opened his mouth, but the words died on his lips. He was looking into the calm, unblinking eyes of the city's most feared phantom, a man who had retired from a throne of shadows, a king who had abdicated but never surrendered his crown. He was looking at the man this quiet waitress had saved from a bullet just yesterday. To understand the impossible weight of that hand on Frank Henderson's shoulder, to grasp the tectonic shift that was occurring in the small universe of the Starlight Diner, you have to go back 24 hours. Yesterday had begun like any other day for Alara. The alarm clock had blared at 4:30 in the morning, a cruel shriek in the deep, pre-dawn dark. She had risen from her small bed in her smaller apartment, a room that was less a home and more a holding cell. It was clean, meticulously so, but bare. There were no photographs on the walls, no trinkets on the shelves. There was nothing that tied her to a past, and nothing that promised a future. It was a place for someone who was hiding. She was hiding from a man whose memory was a brand on her soul, a man whose promises had turned to poison. She sent most of her meager earnings to a sister in another state, a sister who was saving it for her, building a small nest egg for an escape that felt more like a distant dream with every passing day. The diner was her sanctuary and her prison. It was a place of routine, of predictability. The smell of frying bacon, the hiss of the coffee machine, the low murmur of the regulars. These were the sounds of her life. She moved through the space with a quiet, practiced grace, her steps light, her smile gentle. Her kindness was not a performance. It was her nature. It was the one part of herself she had refused to let her past extinguish. She remembered the regulars' orders. She asked after their families. She treated every person who walked through that door, from the wealthy businessman to the homeless man seeking a moment of warmth, with the same unwavering dignity. This, for some reason, infuriated Frank Henderson. He saw her gentleness as weakness, a flaw in the fabric of the world that he felt compelled to tear at. He arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, every day, and took the same stool at the corner of the counter, his personal throne. That morning, the cruelty began subtly. "Elara, sweetheart," he'd called out, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "This silverware is spotted. You trying to give me cholera?" She had quietly taken the fork and knife, polished them again until they gleamed, and returned them with a soft, "I'm sorry about that, Mr. Henderson." He had grunted, a sound of dissatisfaction. Her refusal to be rattled was a constant source of frustration for him. An hour later, he'd complained about his eggs. "I said over easy, not raw. Look at this. It's practically still clucking." Arthur, the old cook in the back, a man with hands like gnarled oak and a heart of gold, had made them perfectly. Elara knew this. Frank knew this, but she had simply taken the plate back. "My apologies. I'll have Arthur make you a fresh plate right away." She absorbed his casual cruelty like the earth absorbs the rain. She knew that to fight back would be to give him the satisfaction he craved. Her quiet endurance was a form of defiance, a shield he could not comprehend and therefore could not breach. The other customers watched, their sympathy for her a silent, palpable thing. They detested Frank, but he was like a force of nature, a bitter wind that you just had to endure until it passed. Then, around noon, the quiet man had walked in. He was unassuming. He wore a simple, worn black jacket and dark jeans. He wasn't old, perhaps in his late 30s, but he carried himself with a stillness that seemed ancient. He sat at the far end of the counter, away from everyone, and ordered a black coffee. Elara served him, and something about him made her pause. It was his eyes. They held a profound, bottomless sadness. He stared into his coffee cup as if it held the answers to the universe, his shoulders slumped with a weight that seemed more than just physical. He looked lost. She felt a pang of empathy, a recognition of a fellow soul adrift. She found herself watching him, ensuring his cup was never empty, offering him a small, genuine smile whenever she passed. He never smiled back, but he would give a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. For hours, he just sat there, a statue carved from grief, taking up space in her diner. The afternoon rush came and went. The diner settled into its late afternoon lull. The quiet man was still there. Elara was wiping down the counter when she saw his cup was low again. She brewed a fresh pot, even though it was near the end of her shift. She poured him a steaming cup. "On the house," she said softly, placing it in front of him. He looked up, and for the first time, his eyes focused on her. Really focused. He seemed to see past the uniform, past the tired smile, and into the core of her. It was an unnerving, intense gaze. "Why?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Elara shrugged, a small, bird-like movement of her shoulders. "You look like you needed it." A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He gave that same small nod, and returned his gaze to the cup. That was when the door burst open. Two men, their faces obscured by ski masks, stormed in. They were armed with pistols, their movements sharp, professional, and terrifying. The diner erupted into chaos. A woman screamed. Plates crashed to the floor. People scrambled, diving under tables. Their peaceful afternoon shattered into a million pieces of primal fear. Time seemed to slow down for Alara. Her senses sharpened. She saw everything with a surreal clarity. The way the light gleamed on the barrel of a gun. The panicked, wide eyes of the young couple in the corner booth. The way Arthur, the cook, reached for the heavy cast-iron skillet he kept by the grill. Her gaze locked onto the two intruders. They weren't robbing the place. Their movements were too targeted. They scanned the room, their eyes sweeping past the cowering customers. They were hunting. And then their eyes found the quiet man at the end of the counter. He hadn't moved. He hadn't dived for cover. He sat perfectly still, his hand resting beside his coffee cup, his posture suddenly radiating an aura of lethal calm. He was no longer a lost soul. He was a predator that had been disturbed. One of the gunmen raised his weapon, aiming directly at the quiet man's head. Everything happened in a heartbeat. Alara didn't think. She didn't weigh the consequences. She didn't consider her own safety. She saw a life about to be extinguished, and her body reacted with an instinct she didn't know she possessed. An instinct to shield, to protect. She launched herself from behind the counter. With a desperate cry, she flew across the short distance and tackled the quiet man, shoving him off his stool into the floor. She landed on top of him, curling her small body over his larger frame, making herself a shield. A deafening crack echoed through the diner. The bullet hissed past, exactly where the man's head had been a second before. It slammed into the wall, showering them with plaster dust. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel the man's hard, unyielding body beneath her, could feel his stunned stillness. The wail of distant sirens cut through the tension. The gunmen exchanged a panicked glance. This hadn't gone according to plan. A civilian was involved. The target was down. The police were coming. They made a decision. They turned and fled, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. The silence they left behind was heavier, more profound, than the noise that had preceded it. It was a silence filled with the metallic taste of fear and the smell of cordite. Slowly, shakily, people began to emerge from under their tables. The diner was a wreck. Overturned chairs, shattered glass, spilled food, but everyone was alive. Alara was still on the floor, her body covering the strangers. She was trembling, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving a cold, terrifying emptiness in its wake. A hand, strong and steady, came to rest on her back. "You can get up now," the man's deep voice rumbled beneath her. "It's over." She pushed herself up, her limbs feeling like lead. She looked down at him. He was watching her, his obsidian eyes no longer filled with sadness, but with something else. Something intense and burning. Awe. Disbelief. He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion, his grace belying his size. He looked at her, then at the bullet hole in the wall. He looked back at her. He seemed to be piecing together an impossible puzzle. The sirens were closer now, screaming, through the streets. "The police will have questions," Alara whispered, her voice hoarse. The man's expression hardened, becoming shuttered and remote. "I don't talk to the police." He reached into his jacket, and for a terrifying second, Alara thought he was pulling out a weapon. Instead, he withdrew a thick wad of cash. He peeled off several $100 bills and pressed them into her hand. "For the damages," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "And for you." Before she could protest, before she could even form a word, he turned and walked towards the back exit. He moved with a silent, purposeful stride, a ghost slipping back into the shadows. By the time the first police car skidded to a halt outside, he was gone. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, sharp questions, and the concerned faces of her friends and regulars. She gave a statement, her voice shaky. She described the men, the chaos. She didn't mention the quiet man's strange intensity or his sudden departure. She just said a customer had been targeted and she'd tried to help. The police called her a hero. Her boss gave her the next day off. But as she lay in her bed that night, sleep refused to come. She couldn't shake the feeling of the man's eyes on her. That look of burning, unreadable intensity. She had thrown herself into the path of a bullet for a complete stranger. It was a reckless, foolish act, born of an impulse she didn't understand. She had saved a man's life, and in doing so, she had irrevocably, terrifyingly, altered her own, which brought everything back to the present. Back to the diner, a day later. Back to Frank Henderson, his face a mask of rage, and back to the tall, silent man in the perfect suit, his hand resting on Frank's shoulder with the weight of a tombstone. Alara had come into work despite being given the day off. The four walls of her apartment felt like they were closing in on her, and the familiar routine of the diner was a comfort. She needed to feel normal. Frank, however, was not interested in normal. He was furious. The morning papers had a small article about the attempted robbery, mentioning the brave waitress. Alara's heroism had stolen the spotlight in the small world of the diner, and Frank couldn't stand it. His power came from being the center of negative attention, and she had inadvertently usurped him. So he had launched his attack, culminating in the thrown coffee cup. Now, the quiet man stood there, a silent arbiter. Frank finally found his voice, a pathetic, blustering squeak. "Who the hell do you think you are? Get your hand off me." The man did not remove his hand. He didn't even seem to hear him. His gaze was fixed on Alara. He was looking at her with that same intensity from the day before, but it was different now. It was no longer just awe. It was possessive. It was proprietary. "Are you all right?" he asked her, his voice low and calm, cutting through the tension. Alara could only nod, her throat suddenly tight. The man's eyes shifted, moving from Alara to Frank Henderson, and the temperature in the diner dropped another 10 degrees. The calm in his eyes was replaced by a chilling emptiness, a void so absolute it was terrifying. "I believe I told you to let her go," he said. "It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, a correction of a cosmic error." Frank, emboldened by a lifetime of bullying people smaller than him, made his final, fatal mistake. He tried to shove the man's hand away. "I'm not going to tell you again, pal." The man's fingers tightened on Frank's shoulder. It was a subtle movement, almost invisible, but Frank's face went white. A choked gasp escaped his lips. His knees buckled. The sheer, focused pressure was immense, a vice of bone and sinew. It wasn't brute force. It was a surgeon's precise application of agony. "You will not touch her," the man said, his voice a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "You will not speak to her. You will not look at her. You will finish your coffee, pay your bill, and you will never set foot in this establishment again. Am I understood?" Frank couldn't speak. He could only manage a series of pathetic, gurgling noises, his eyes wide with a terror he had only ever inflicted, never experienced. He nodded frantically, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an invisible, omnipotent hand. The man released him. Frank stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, his face a mess of pain and humiliation. He looked around at the faces of the other customers, the people he had terrorized for years. He saw no sympathy. He saw only contempt and a cold, satisfying dose of long-overdue justice. Without another word, he threw a few crumpled bills on the counter and practically fled from the diner, a coward exposed. The silence he left in his wake was different. The fear was gone, replaced by a stunned, breathless awe. The stranger turned his full attention back to Alara. He took a step closer, his imposing frame seeming to shield her from the rest of the world. "I did not get a chance to thank you properly yesterday," he said. "You don't have to," Alara managed to say. "Anyone would have done the same." A faint, sad smile touched the man's lips, a fleeting expression that was gone as quickly as it appeared. "No," he said softly. "They wouldn't have. In my entire life, I have known only a handful of people who would do what you did, and you did it for a stranger." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the faint weariness in her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. "My name is Kaylin Vance," he said, "but people call me Kale." The name meant nothing to Alara, but in the back, she heard a sharp intake of breath. Arthur, the old cook, was standing at the pass-through, his face pale. He recognized the name. Every old-timer in the Princeton city, every cop, Every criminal, every person who understood the true currents of power that flowed beneath the city's surface knew that name. It was a name whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence, the name of a king in exile. To understand what happened next, you need to know who Kalen Cale Vance really was. He was not a businessman. He was not a politician. He was, or had been, the undisputed ruler of the city's criminal underworld. He had inherited the organization from his father and reshaped it. Where his father had ruled with brute force and fear, Cale had ruled with intelligence, strategy, and a rigid, unshakable code of honor. His empire was built on loyalty, not terror. His people were protected. Their families were cared for. Betrayal was the only sin he would not tolerate, and his punishment for it was swift, absolute, and legendary. He did not seek violence, but when it was necessary, he wielded it with the detached precision of a master craftsman. He was a paradox, a man of immense violence who craved order, a criminal who despised chaos. And then, 10 years ago, he had lost everything that mattered. His wife, Lena, was the light in his shadowy world. She was a musician, a woman of gentle grace and fierce intelligence who saw the man, not the monster. And they had a daughter, Maya, a little girl with her mother's smile and her father's serious, watchful eyes. They were his reason. They were the anchor that kept him from being consumed by the darkness of his life. He had been planning his exit, a way to legitimize his businesses, to build a future where his daughter would never have to know the true source of their wealth. He was too late. A rival, a brutish man named Rico Salvi, saw Kyle's desire for peace as weakness. He planted a bomb in Kyle's car. But that day, Kale had taken a different car, sending his driver to take Lena and Maya to a piano recital. He remembered the moment he heard the news. He was in a comet meeting, overlooking the city from his penthouse office. The phone call came, a subordinate's voice cracking with terror. Kale's world didn't just break, it ceased to exist. The vibrant colors of his life turned to ash in a single, fiery moment. The grief was a physical thing, a monster that hollowed him out, leaving behind nothing but a cold, burning rage. What he did to Rico Salvi and his organization was not war. It was an extermination. He dismantled Salvi's empire in a single week. He didn't just kill Salvi, he erased him. He took his money, his power, his allies, his legacy. He left him with nothing but the terrifying knowledge of who was coming for him. When Kale finally found him, Salvi was a broken, weeping shell of a man. Kale's justice was quiet, personal, and final. Afterward, the fire in him went out. The rage was gone, replaced by a vast, empty silence. He had his revenge, but it hadn't brought back his family. It hadn't filled the void. So he walked away. He handed the reins of his organization to his most trusted lieutenant, a man named Marcus, with a single directive: maintain order. Kale retreated from the world, becoming a ghost, a legend whispered in back alleys and boardrooms. He lived in a large, empty house, surrounded by the memories of a life that was no longer his. He had made a pact with himself, a vow to the memory of his wife. No more violence, no more of the life that had cost him everything. He had kept that vow for 10 years. The day of the shooting was the anniversary of his wife's death. He had gone to the Starlight Diner because it was the last place he and Lena had shared a simple, happy moment together, a quiet cup of coffee on a sunny afternoon a week before she died. He went there every year to sit in that same booth, to remember, to punish himself with the memory of what he had lost. He had been lost in that grief when Alara had shown him a small, simple kindness. Her gentle smile, her quiet dignity, the way she treated him not as a phantom but as a person. It had reminded him so much of Lena that it was a physical ache in his chest. And then, she had shielded him. She had thrown her own fragile body in the path of a bullet meant for him. An act of selfless, reckless, insane courage. In that moment, she had done for him what he had failed to do for his own family. She had protected. That act had shattered the vow he had made to himself. The attack was a message. A new player in the city, someone young and foolish, was making a move, trying to eliminate the Ghost King to solidify their own power. They had failed, but they had created a new problem. They had created a witness. Alara. They would come for her. They would see her as a loose end, a threat to be eliminated. His vow to live a quiet life was now in direct conflict with a deeper, more primal code that was etched into his very soul. You protect those who protect you. His past was reaching out to claim him, and this time, it was threatening to swallow an innocent woman whole. He would not allow it. He couldn't save his wife and daughter, but he would be damned if he failed to save this girl. Back in the diner, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Kale's focus was entirely on Alara. The men who came here yesterday were not robbers, he said, his voice low and serious. They were assassins, and I was their target. Alara's eyes widened. The color drained from her face. Because you saved me, he continued, his words precise and heavy. You are now in danger. They know you saw their faces. They will not allow a witness to remain. They will come for you. This was the reality of the world he inhabited, a world of brutal, simple logic, a world Alara had unwittingly stumbled into. What do I do? She whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. The fear she had held at bay was finally beginning to seep in. You will come with me, Kale stated. It was not a suggestion. Two men appeared at the diner's entrance. They were dressed in dark suits like Kale, their faces impassive, their movements economical and silent. They were his lieutenants, Silas and Julian, men who had been with him for years, loyal to a fault. They had been waiting outside, a silent, invisible perimeter. Kale's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. He understood the enormity of what he was about to do, the life he was about to upend. I have a home. It is secure. You will be safe there, he explained. But that is only a temporary solution. As long as you are seen as a separate person, a witness, you will be a target. The only way to grant you absolute, permanent protection is to bring you under my name, to make you a part of my world in a way no one would ever dare to challenge. He took a slight breath, as if the words themselves were heavy. They will not dare to touch the wife of Kalen Vance. The word hung in the air between them. Wife. It was an insane, unbelievable proposition. It wasn't a proposal of marriage born of love or affection. It was a strategic maneuver, a move on a chessboard she didn't even know she was playing on. He was offering her a gilded cage as a shield. You can't be serious, she breathed, taking a step back. I have never been more serious in my life, he replied, his voice unwavering. This is not the life you chose. I know that, and I am sorry for bringing this darkness to your door. But it is here. We can either face it, or we can let it consume you. I will not let it consume you. He was giving her the illusion of a choice, but they both knew there was none. Her other option was to wait for a bullet in a dark alley, to live in constant fear, looking over her shoulder, until the day her luck ran out. The life she had been living, the quiet desperation and the dream of escape, was over. It had ended the moment she'd pushed him to the floor. Suddenly, one of Kale's lieutenants, Silas, stepped forward. He was holding a man by the scruff of his neck, a terrified, sweating man with a fresh bruise on his cheek. It was one of the gunmen from the day before. They had found him. The diner, which had just begun to breathe again, held its collective breath. It was transforming from a crime scene into something else entirely. A courtroom. Kale didn't even look at the captured gunman. His eyes remained on Alara. I do not make idle threats, he said softly, and I do not leave business unfinished. He finally turned to the gunman, his demeanor shifting. The quiet protector vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating mind of the king he once was. Who sent you? Kale's voice was like ice. The man trembled, refusing to speak. Kale sighed, a sound of weary disappointment. You have one chance. You can tell me, and you will live. You will be broken. You will have nothing, but you will draw breath. Or you can remain silent, and your existence will simply be erased. Your choice. The gunman stared into Kale's empty eyes and saw not a threat, but a promise. He saw the abyss waiting for him. Marco, the man croaked. Marco Gallo. Kale nodded slowly. The name registered. Marco Gallo, the son of an old rival, A young, ambitious fool who thought Kale's retirement meant he was weak, a lion with no teeth. He had miscalculated. Badly. He's getting greedy, Kale mused, more to himself than to anyone else. He thinks the throne is empty. He pulled a phone from his pocket. It was a simple, old-fashioned device, not a smartphone. It had one purpose: communication with the pillars of the empire he had built. He dialed a number. "It's me," he said into the phone. The person on the other end would have recognized his voice instantly, a voice they probably hadn't heard in years. "Marco Gallo. I want his accounts frozen. All of them. The offshore holdings, the shell corporations, everything. Call in his markers. I want him penniless by sundown." He hung up. He dialed another number. "The port," he said without preamble. "Gallo has a shipment coming in tonight. Container 74, B. An anonymous tip to the authorities would be appropriate." He hung up. He dialed a third number. "Silas has a man here. He will give you the names of Gallo's inner circle. I want you to reach out to them. Let them know that their leader tried to strike a king and missed. Let them know their continued allegiance to him will be unwise. Offer them a better deal." He hung up. In the space of less than a minute, with 3 quiet phone calls, Kale had signed Marco Gallo's death warrant. Not a physical death. That would be too simple, too merciful. He had sentenced him to a social and financial annihilation. He had turned his allies against him, seized his wealth, and alerted the law to his operations. By morning, Marco Gallo would be a man with no money, no power, and no friends, with the authorities closing in. He would be a ghost, haunted by the powerful phantom he had tried to slay. This was true power. Not the loud, brutish anger of men like Frank Henderson. Not the violent ambition of men like Marco Gallo. It was the quiet, absolute ability to remake the world with a few whispered words. Kale put his phone away, and his attention returned, once again, to Alara. The entire diner had witnessed this cold, methodical deconstruction of another man's life. They now understood what Arthur the cook already knew. This was not a man you said no to. "The choice is yours, Alara," Kale said, his voice softening again. "But we are out of time." Alara looked at his outstretched hand. She looked at the faces of her regulars, now filled with a fearful respect. She thought of her tiny, empty apartment, which was no longer a sanctuary but a trap. She thought of the man she was hiding from, a monster from her past, and realized that Kale, for all his darkness, was a different kind of monster entirely. He was not a monster who devoured. He was a monster who shielded. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The life she had known was gone. The dream of a quiet, anonymous escape was dead. A new, terrifying, and uncertain path had opened up before her. Slowly, she placed her small, trembling hand into his large, steady one. His fingers closed around hers, a gesture of finality, of ownership, of protection. "Silas," Kale said, not taking his eyes off her. "Take care of our friend here, and leave enough to compensate the owner for the disruption. Double it." He then looked around the diner, his gaze sweeping over the silent customers. "Everyone here has my gratitude for their discretion. Nothing happened here today." It was a quiet command, an order that would be obeyed without question. He gently led Alara towards the door. As they passed the kitchen, Arthur the cook stepped out. He was an old man, his face a roadmap of long years and hard work. He looked at KL, and there was no fear in his eyes, only a deep, weary understanding. He nodded once, a sign of respect. Then he looked at Alara, his expression full of a paternal concern that brought tears to her eyes. "Some men use their strength to break things, little bird," Arthur said, his voice raspy. "The strong ones, the real ones, they use it to shield things. You chose right." His words were a small blessing, a final piece of her old life that she could carry with her into the new one. Kale led her out of the diner and into the gray light of the city. A sleek black sedan was waiting at the curb, the engine purring. Julian held the back door open for them. The car was an armored fortress, its windows tinted so dark they were like polished obsidian. As Alara slid onto the soft leather seat, she took one last look at the Starlight Diner. Her prison, her sanctuary, It already looked like a scene from someone else's life. The car pulled away from the curb, gliding silently into the flow of traffic. It moved through the city like a shark through water, unseen, powerful, belonging to a different, more dangerous world. Ilara sat in silence, her hand still loosely held in Kale's. She felt strangely calm. The fear had receded, replaced by a sense of surreal inevitability. She was a leaf caught in a powerful current, and there was no point in fighting it. She could only see where it would take her. Kale's home was not a house. It was a fortress. It was a sprawling stone mansion set on a private estate far from the city, surrounded by a high wall and a small forest of ancient trees. The gates, wrought iron and imposing, swung open silently as they approached. The grounds were meticulously manicured, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed woods that bordered the property. Inside, the house was a contradiction. It was vast and opulent, with high ceilings, marble floors, and dark wood paneling. Yet it felt empty. It was a museum of a life that was no longer lived. There were priceless works of art on the walls, but they seemed to hold no joy. The furniture was elegant and expensive, but it offered no comfort. The air was still and silent, heavy with the dust of memory and grief. A staff of silent, efficient housekeepers and security personnel greeted them. They moved with a quiet deference, their eyes never quite meeting Kale's, but they looked at Ilara with a mixture of curiosity and respect. The news of her new status had clearly preceded them. She was no longer a waitress. She was the lady of the house, the wife of Kalen Vance. Kale led her to a suite of rooms in a private wing of the mansion. It was larger than her entire apartment. A spacious bedroom with a four-poster bed, a sitting room with a fireplace, and a marble bathroom that looked like it belonged in a Roman palace. "This will be yours," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. "You will be safe. Here. No one can reach you." He showed her a wardrobe filled with new clothes in her size, a dressing table with unopened perfumes and cosmetics. He had prepared for her arrival. The thought was both comforting and deeply unsettling. He had made this decision for her long before he had walked into the diner that morning. "Rest," he told her. "I have business to attend to. We will talk more this evening." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the silent, luxurious cage he had built for her. The days that followed were a blur of quiet adjustment. Ilara explored the mansion, a ghost in its empty halls. She discovered a magnificent library filled with thousands of books, a music room with a grand piano covered by a white sheet, and a sprawling garden with a weeping willow tree that seemed to carry the same sadness as the house itself. She learned the rhythm of her new life. Kale was a creature of routine. He would rise early, spend most of his day in his study, a room she was not invited into, and emerge only for meals, which they took in a cavernous dining room, sitting at opposite ends of a long, polished table. Their conversations were stilted, formal. He would ask if she was comfortable, if she needed anything. She would reply that she was fine. He was a polite, considerate warden. He was always distant, his mind clearly elsewhere, wrestling with the ghosts of his past and the reawakened demands of his present. Yet, she saw small glimpses of the man beneath the icy exterior. One afternoon, she found a book left on the table in her sitting room, a collection of poetry by a little-known author she had once mentioned enjoying to a customer at the diner. He had remembered. Another time, she was wandering through the garden and found him standing under the weeping willow, his hand gently touching a small, faded carving in the trunk, a simple L+M inside a heart. Lena and Maya. The grief on his face in that unguarded moment was so profound, so raw, that she had to turn away, feeling like an intruder on a sacred sorrow. She began to understand that his coldness was not a rejection of her, but a shield for himself. He was a man who had loved so deeply that the loss of that love had nearly destroyed him. He had locked his heart away in a stone vault, and he was terrified of letting anyone near it again. The staff treated her with a formal, unwavering respect. She was Mrs. Vance. They catered to her every need, but she found herself missing the simple, honest camaraderie of the diner. She missed Arthur's gruff affection, the easy chatter with the regulars. She tried to befriend the housekeepers, but there was a professional distance she could not seem to cross. She was their boss, not their friend. She was safe. She was living in a world of unimaginable luxury, and she had never felt more alone. A week after her arrival, Kale summoned her to his study. It was the first time she had been allowed inside. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, but unlike the library, these were filled with ledgers and files. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, and a bank of monitors on the wall showed security feeds from all over the property. This was the nerve center of his world. He was standing by the window, looking out at the darkening grounds. "It's done," he said without turning around. Marco Gallo was arrested this morning. The authorities found him trying to flee the country with a fake passport and a suitcase full of cash. What little he had left. He turned to face her. His organization is in chaos. His lieutenants have already sworn allegiance to Marcus. The threat to you is neutralized. Permanently. Ilara felt a wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. It was over. The immediate danger was gone. But a new, more complicated question took its place. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "This arrangement, our marriage, is it over?" Kale was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face. He seemed to be weighing his words with immense care. "The world now knows you as my wife," he said slowly. "To undo that would create questions. It would draw attention. It would make you vulnerable again. Not from Gallo's people, but from others. My enemies are numerous. They would see you as a weakness, a way to get to me." He took a step closer to her. The distance between them, which had always felt like miles, shrank to mere inches. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the flecks of gray at his temples, the fine lines around his eyes. "My protection is permanent," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur. "That is not negotiable. I made a vow, not to my past, but to you. I will not fail to protect you." He paused, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a crack in the stone facade. "The rest," he continued, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "is your choice. This house does not have to be your prison. You are free to go. I will set you up with a new life, a new identity, anywhere in the world you want to go. You will be protected from a distance. You will never have to see me again." He was giving her back her agency. He was offering her the escape she had always dreamed of, a life free from fear, free from the past. "But," he added, and the word was heavy with an unspoken hope, "I hope you choose to stay." He wasn't just offering her safety anymore. He was offering her something more, a partnership, a shared life, a chance for two broken people to find a way to heal together in the quiet solitude of their shared fortress. Ilara looked into his eyes, and she saw it all. The grief that had hollowed him out, the honor that drove him, the profound loneliness that mirrored her own. She thought of her old life, the constant struggle, the fear of a past that was always one step behind her. That life was gone. This new life was terrifying, and strange, and uncertain. But in Kale's gaze, she did not see a monster or a king. She saw a man who understood what it meant to lose everything. A man who, like her, knew the value of shielding others from pain. She thought of the book he had left for her, of the quiet way he made sure her favorite tea was always stocked in the kitchen. She thought of the profound sadness in his eyes when he looked at the carving on the willow tree. She had saved his life with a single, impulsive act, and he, in turn, had saved hers with his power and his darkness. They were bound together by a debt of violence and courage. She slowly raised her hand and placed it on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. "I think," she said softly, her voice clear and unwavering for the first time in a long time, "that I'm already home." A profound stillness settled over the room. Kale looked down at her hand on his chest, then back up to her eyes. The stone walls around his heart did not crumble, but for the first time in 10 years, a small, fragile ray of light had found its way through a crack. He raised his own hand and gently covered hers, his touch no longer a symbol of ownership or protection, but a silent, mutual acceptance. A beginning. Outside, the wind rustled through the leaves of the ancient trees, whispering secrets to the silent, watching house. A new chapter had begun, not of a king and his captive, but of two survivors learning to build a new kind of kingdom, a fortress not of stone and steel, but of shared solace and quiet strength. The waitress had saved the mob boss, and in doing so, they had just begun to save each other.